Before you touch the saw, you listen to the wood. The beam lies across two supports in the half-light of the workshop, pale where its surface has already been worked, and darker along the edges where the outer wood remains. It looks straight, strong, good enough for the job waiting for it. You place one hand against the timber and strike it. The sound is short and hard. You move farther along the beam and strike again. Something changes, only slightly, but enough to make you stop. There is something inside this piece of timber that you cannot see, and if you are wrong about it now, you may not discover your mistake until long after the wood has left your hands. Perhaps when a door begins pulling against its frame, perhaps when a joint starts opening, perhaps when weight settles onto a structure that was supposed to remain where you put it. The beam looks perfectly usable, so why are you putting it aside? Welcome to History of Ordinary People. Here we leave behind the famous names and step into the lives of the people who built the world around them, live the lives history forgot. The beam remains where you left it. For now, there is other work to do. Your day began several hours earlier, before enough light had reached the streets of Rome to reveal much beyond the nearest walls. You woke with yesterday still sitting heavily in your shoulders. One hand was stiff when you closed it, and the base of your thumb carried a tender patch where a tool handle had rubbed against the skin. There were smaller marks too, cuts and splinters that had stopped being noteworthy years ago. Nothing serious enough to keep you from work. You dressed, ate little, and stepped outside while the building around you was beginning to stir. Rome was never truly silent, even at this hour. Feet moved somewhere beyond the corner. A door scraped open. Water struck stone. Farther away, a cart announced itself through the uneven rhythm of a wooden wheel passing over the street. You knew the route to the workshop well enough that you barely watched where you were going. You knew where rainwater lingered between paving stones, where the street narrowed unexpectedly, and where yesterday's rubbish might still be waiting beside a wall. Above you, shutters remained closed on some upper floors, while others had begun to open into the weak morning light. The city that people centuries from now will imagine as a city of stone is already waking around you. But the Rome you know is full of wood. The door closing behind you is wood. The shutters opening above the street are wood. Stairs climb through crowded buildings on timber supports. Roof tiles rest upon wooden structures hidden beneath them. Shop fronts are closed and secured with boards. Merchants move crates and containers. Carts roll on wooden wheels. Workmen climb wooden scaffolds beside walls that future generations will remember only as brick, concrete and stone. Even some of Rome's greatest structures depend upon timber while they are being built. Wood supports work in progress, carries weight, provides access, gives shape to construction, and then often disappears when its purpose has been served. Much of your work will disappear too. The stone will remain. And one day, that difference will change how people imagine your city. You know none of this, of course. To you, wood is simply everywhere. By the time you reach the workshop, enough daylight has entered the street to work without a lamp. The front stands open toward the road, allowing light into a space crowded not with decoration, but with the accumulated necessities of a trade. Long pieces of timber rest along one side. Shorter offcuts have been saved rather than thrown away, because a piece too small for today's job may be exactly right for tomorrow's repair. A heavy workbench occupies its familiar place. Tools wait where hands expect to find them, and curled shavings from yesterday still lie beneath the bench. You push a few aside with your foot. The smell is familiar enough that you usually stop noticing it. Dry timber and old dust, resin from freshly worked wood, the faint trace of smoke from outside, and the sharper scent released whenever a blade opens a new surface. One small offcut has fallen near the front of the workshop. You pick it up rather than kicking it into the street. Too short for a beam, too narrow for a board, still useful. You turn it once in your hand, then place it with the other saved pieces. Good timber has already cost someone the labour of cutting a tree, trimming it, moving it, transporting it into a city hungry for building material, and allowing it time to become suitable for work. Throwing away a useful piece because it happens to be small would make little sense. Then your attention returns to the longer timbers. This is where the day's real work begins, not with cutting, with choosing. To an inexperienced eye, two pieces of the same timber may appear almost identical. To you, the differences begin appearing before a tool touches either one. You look along the fibres. You notice where they run cleanly and where they begin to turn. You find knots and consider where they sit rather than rejecting them automatically. You sight along the length for movement and distortion. You consider what the piece will eventually be asked to do. A timber suitable for one purpose may be a poor choice for another. Roman carpenters work with several kinds of wood because no single species answers every need. Some timbers offer strength and weight. Others are valued because they are lighter or straighter, easier to shape, or better suited to particular conditions. But even knowing the species is only the beginning. Every tree grew differently. Every piece carries that history inside it. The grain may guide your blade cleanly along the surface or turn against it. A knot may matter little in one position and weaken the very place where you intend to cut a joint. Timber continues to change as it loses moisture, and a piece that appears obedient now can twist or warp later if you have misunderstood it. These are lessons learned slowly. You did not become a carpenter when you first learned how to swing an axe. The tools are the simpler part. An axe removes wood and adds shapes and flattens it. A saw divides it. A chisel allows you to work into places an axe cannot reach. An auger makes a hole. Knowing where to place those tools, how much material to remove, and when to stop is what takes years. The beam you examined earlier is still waiting. You run your hand over it again. Your fingertips cannot reveal everything hidden inside a piece of timber, but your eyes can follow the direction of the fibres, and the timber itself can sometimes offer another clue. You strike it once more. Listen. Move your hand. Strike again. There is the difference. The sound passing through the timber is not quite what you want to hear. Combined with what you can see in the grain, it is enough to make you hesitate. Someone with less experience might already be marking the first cut. You set the beam aside, not because it is useless. Wood is too valuable to divide so casually into good and bad. It may simply be wrong for this job. Its future has changed. You will decide what to do with it later. Another length is brought forward, and this one tells a different story. Its fibres run more cleanly. You sight along its length, turn it, inspect the other face, and finally reach for the tools. Only now does the cutting begin. The first stage is physical. The adze has been part of a carpenter's work for generations, and in experienced hands it can remove material with remarkable control. Its blade works across the surface as you gradually bring irregular timber toward the shape you need. You set your feet, lift the tool and bring it down. The edge bites. A pale shaving falls. You adjust your position and repeat the movement, settling into a rhythm learned through thousands of strokes. Your shoulders provide the force, but your hands guide the edge, and your eyes remain on the surface ahead of it. The work is practiced without ever becoming careless. The blade is iron. Your feet are close. There is nothing between a badly directed stroke and flesh, so you know where your body must be before the adze begins to move. Soon the floor around you is covered with fresh shavings, their pale surfaces brighter than the older debris beneath them. One catches against your sandal. Another clings briefly to your tunic before falling away. You stop. Not because you are tired, because every stroke removes something you cannot replace. You sight along the surface, find a place still sitting slightly proud, and take only what is necessary. Then you check again. This is how much of skilled work passes, not in dramatic acts of creation, but in corrections small enough that the eventual owner may never know they happened. A fraction removed from one edge. A line adjusted before it becomes a cut, a joint tested before it is forced, a piece rejected from one purpose and saved for another. If nobody notices those decisions when the work is finished, you have probably made them correctly. Outside, Rome grows louder. A hammer begins ringing somewhere nearby, iron against iron, and you recognise the rhythm of a smith at work. Some of the tools in your workshop began in a place like his. Iron edges wear, they dull, they need sharpening, repairing, eventually replacing. In return, the smith works at benches made from timber and grips tools whose wooden handles were shaped by hands like yours. Neither trade stands alone for long. Later today, that will become even clearer. The timber in front of you is not destined to remain here. It must eventually meet work being done elsewhere, and when it does, your measurements will have to agree with decisions made by another pair of hands. For now, you begin laying out the joint. Your eye can tell you when something appears wrong, but experience does not mean guessing. Measuring rods, squares, plumb lines, and other simple layout tools allow a carpenter to turn judgment into repeatable work. You mark the timber carefully. The joint will connect this piece to another without depending entirely upon iron to hold them together. You begin with a chisel. The opening is small at first. A controlled strike from the mallet drives the edge into the timber, and the fibres begin to separate. You reposition the blade and strike again, removing the waste gradually rather than trying to force the entire opening at once. The work slows. This is where impatience becomes expensive. Cut beyond the line and the joint may loosen. Drive too aggressively and the timber may split where you never intended it to. So you remove a little, clear the opening, look again and continue. The mortise gradually takes shape. Eventually you bring the matching piece forward and try the fit. It stops. Too tight. You withdraw it. There is no reason for frustration yet. The wood has simply shown you where the surfaces meet. A faint mark identifies the point of resistance. You return to the chisel and remove a shaving so thin that it curls against the blade. Then you try again. Farther this time. Still not enough. Another adjustment. Another test. Outside, people pass the workshop entrance. Somewhere a seller calls into the street. Another cart rattles over stone. For several minutes, none of Rome matters as much as the small amount of timber, preventing these two pieces from fitting together. You make one final correction. This time the joint closes. Your hands feel the difference immediately. Firm, controlled, where it should be. You rest them against the timber for a moment. There is no audience for this. No one applauds a joint that fits. The person who eventually uses what you're making may never know how many times you tested it, or how little wood separated a poor fit from a good one. That is part of the work. You separate the pieces again because there is still more to do, and as you reach for the next tool, your eyes return briefly to the beam resting against the wall. The one that looks straight, the one that sounded wrong. You have not forgotten it. Before this day is finished, you will have to decide what that timber can safely become. But another problem is already waiting outside the workshop. The piece you are shaping has to fit into something that was built by someone else. And when you reach it, you are going to discover that the measurements you have been given and the building standing in front of you are not quite the same thing. The problem is waiting for you less than an hour later. You carry the prepared timber through the streets with another carpenter, each of you taking one end. Rome makes even an ordinary load awkward. At one corner you turn it sideways to pass a cart. At another, you lift your end while two men squeeze beneath it without appearing particularly concerned. By the time you reach the building, your shoulder has begun to ache. You lower the timber and look at the opening where it's supposed to fit. Something is wrong. Nothing dramatic. The wall is standing, the existing frame has not collapsed, and your measurements are not mistaken. But the opening is not quite the shape those measurements promised. You crouch beside one side and look upward. The masonry has its own irregularities. Older timber has moved. Surfaces measured separately do not meet as neatly as the marks on your new piece assume they will. The measurement is not useless. The building is simply real. This is why you left enough material to make adjustments here. You lift the timber into position and find the first point of contact. One end needs a small correction, another farther along the edge. Too much, and you create a gap. Too little, and it will never sit correctly. The timber comes down. You remove a little. Test. Another correction. Test again. There is no perfect line hidden inside the building waiting for you to discover it. Your task is to make two imperfect things agree. By the fourth fitting, the timber settles farther into place. You run your fingers along the meeting surface and find the remaining resistance. You could force it. A few hard blows might persuade the piece into position, and from the street it might even look finished. But force does not make a bad fit good. It only hides the problem until the wood moves again. So the piece comes down once more. A narrow shaving is removed. When you raise it again, the timber settles where you want it. You check one side, then the other. Only when nothing else asks for your attention do you move on. Tomorrow someone may pass beneath this timber without looking at it. They will never know how many times it came down. That is often what successful work looks like. Nothing worth noticing. You gather your tools and return toward the workshop as the streets grow warmer. On the way, a mason is working beside a rising wall. Above him, wooden scaffolding follows the masonry upward. The wall will remain after the job is finished. The scaffold will not. Elsewhere, timber can support the temporary form of an arch while masonry is placed above it, then be removed once the structure can carry itself. Some of the most important wooden things a carpenter makes are never intended to survive. Their purpose is to help something else survive. You continue walking. A shopkeeper folds back wooden shutters. A cart stands nearby on wooden wheels. A bench rests beneath an awning, and farther along a cracked tool handle catches your eye in another man's hand. Once you spend your life working with wood, it becomes difficult not to notice it. There is even a door along this route that has bothered you for months. It is not yours. You did not make it, and nobody has asked you to repair it. Still, every time you pass, your eyes find the same upper corner where the fit has begun to change. Today is no different. You look. Still wrong, then you keep walking. Back at the workshop, you sit in the shade near the entrance and eat. Your hands still smell faintly of fresh timber, and when you break the bread, a tiny curl of sawdust falls from your wrist into your lap. You brush it away. For a short while the tools rest. You flex your fingers and find a splinter near the base of one of them. With a fingernail you work it free and flick it toward the shavings. Then you drink and return to work. A mason needs timber for temporary supports. The pieces are ordinary, but their dimensions and condition still matter. A platform or support that shifts beneath a man's weight is not made safe simply because it will eventually be dismantled. You inspect one length and find a knot near an area likely to carry stress. The knot itself does not make the timber useless. You look at the fibres around it. Consider where the load will fall, then set that piece aside for another position and choose a different one. There is no ceremony to the decision. Nothing happens, and that is precisely the result you want. A poor piece is not used where it should not be used. A dangerous cut is never made. A joint is adjusted instead of forced. Good judgment often leaves behind no evidence of the problem it prevented. You begin preparing the replacement. After several strokes, the adze no longer feels right. It still cuts, but not cleanly. The tool demands slightly more effort, tempting you to compensate with force. You stop. A dull edge wastes strength, and more force means less control. The timber waits while you tend to the blade. The blacksmith made the iron, but keeping its edge useful belongs to you. Every tool in the workshop carries the marks of repeated work. Sharpened, worn, sharpened again. When you return to the timber, the difference is immediate. The blade bites cleanly. By early afternoon, shavings have accumulated beneath the bench again. Sweat darkens parts of your tunic, and your shoulder complains whenever the adze rises. Then a customer arrives carrying an old wooden stool. One leg moves in its joint. The stool is not beautiful. Its seat is stained and its edges worn from years of use. But someone still needs it. You turn it over and test the loose leg. The surrounding wood is worn but serviceable. There is no reason to replace more than necessary. Your eyes move toward the offcuts along the wall. The small piece you saved this morning is still there. Too short for a beam, too narrow for a board, exactly enough for this. You shave a small section from it. Test, adjust, test again. Soon the stool stands on the floor. You press down on the seat and shift the weight. No movement. The owner will never know that part of the repair came from something that could easily have ended in the fire. It does not matter. The stool works. Large pieces become smaller pieces. Smaller pieces become pegs, wedges, repairs, or handles. Only when little useful remains does the wood become fuel. There's too much labour inside timber to waste it casually. The afternoon continues through smaller jobs. A whole board, a peg-shaped, a surface checked, another piece marked. Some tasks belong to buildings, others to repairs or other craftsmen. Some are finished quickly, others will still be waiting tomorrow. And through all of them, the beam from this morning remains against the wall. Eventually you stop in front of it again. You lift one end and turn it toward the light. Nothing dramatic has appeared. No hidden rot. No great crack. The problem is subtler. You follow the direction of the fibres again and consider the work for which the beam was originally intended. It might remain strong for years. But being strong enough is not the same as being right for a particular job. This morning, that uncertainty stopped your saw. Now you make the decision. The beam will be used elsewhere. You mark it accordingly and return it to the stack. Nothing happens. No frame twists months from now. No customer returns with a failure. No one will ever know that the most important thing you did with this piece of timber was decide what not to make from it. People looking at finished carpentry may imagine that skill lives mainly in the hands, the straight cut, the clean joint, the controlled swing of the adze. Those things matter, but your hands can only carry out the decisions that came before them. Which timber, which face, which direction, which joint, which cut, and sometimes which cut not to make. Later in the afternoon, another job takes you back outside. A mason working nearby needs timber adjusted around the temporary supports above his work site, and this problem cannot be solved from the ground. You gather your tools and walk through streets beginning to release some of the day's heat. When you arrive, you look upward. Wooden scaffolding climbs beside the masonry. From below it seems simple. Posts, platforms, braces, all temporary beside something intended to last. You place one hand on the first support and begin to climb. Only when your weight leaves the ground do you feel how much trust a city remembered for stone places in wood. The scaffold answers differently beneath your feet than the street did. Each step sends a little movement through the timber, not enough to alarm you, but enough to remind you that you are standing on something assembled for a purpose and intended eventually to come apart again. You climb with one hand free whenever you can, keeping your tools close to your body. Below, the street becomes narrower, and its individual sounds begin to blend together. A cart passes somewhere beyond the building. Someone calls from below. Higher on the structure comes the scrape of work against masonry. You reach the level where the mason is waiting. From here, the relationship between your trades is easier to see. Stone rises beside timber. Wooden platforms give men somewhere to stand while they work, while supports and braces carry loads that will eventually be carried by the finished structure itself. The mason shows you the problem. One of the timbers must be adjusted where the temporary structure meets the work around it. The space is awkward, and from below it appeared larger than it really is. You kneel and examine the fit. Again, measurement has brought you close. Again, close is not enough. You mark the place where the timber interferes, then look beyond the mark before touching the blade. Removing wood will make the piece fit, but removing too much may weaken it. You brace yourself against the structure and begin. Working here is different from working at your bench. There is less room for your body, nowhere convenient to place a tool, and every shaving falls away beneath you instead of collecting around your feet. You make the first adjustment and test the timber. Still too much resistance. Another small amount comes away. This time it settles farther into position. You check the fit with your hand, then shift your own weight carefully against the structure. Nothing moves where it should not. The mason can continue. For a moment you remain where you are. From this height, Rome presents itself differently. Roofs spread unevenly around you, their tiles hiding the timber beneath. Smoke rises between buildings. Streets appear and disappear behind walls, and somewhere among them are workshops like yours. Ovens already hot from the morning. Stalls, storehouses, carts, doors opening and closing, and countless pieces of wood being used without anyone thinking much about the hands that shaped them. You look down at the scaffold beneath your feet. This too will disappear. Once the masonry can support itself, useful timber may be dismantled and put to work elsewhere. The wall will remain, while much of what allowed men to build it will be removed. You descend carefully. Back on the street, solid ground feels unusually still beneath your feet. The afternoon has begun to soften. Shadows reach farther from the buildings, although the stone beneath you still carries the day's warmth. There is one more task before you return to the workshop. A door needs attention. The complaint is simple enough. It no longer closes properly. You open it, then close it slowly. The resistance appears near the end of the movement. You try again, this time watching the upper edge. There, a faint polished patch shows where wood has been meeting wood. You run your fingers across it. The owner does not need a new door, he needs less than that. Timber moves, frames settle. Years of opening and closing alter the places where surfaces meet, and a door that once fitted cleanly can begin catching without anything being truly broken. You work only where the surfaces interfere. A few careful passes, then the door goes back into position. You test it, it closes. You open it once more and let it travel through the movement. Still good. That is enough. There is no reason to remove more wood simply because the tool is already in your hand. You gather your things and begin walking back. On the way, you pass the other door, the one that has bothered you for months. It still does not belong to you, and nobody has asked you to repair it. Your eyes find the same upper corner anyway. Still wrong. You continue walking. By the time you reach the workshop, the light has changed. The hard brightness of midday no longer reaches as deeply through the open front. Shavings on the floor have lost their pale glare, and the stacked timber throws longer shadows across the wall. Your body feels the day more clearly now. The stiffness in your shoulder has settled into a dull ache. Your hands carry dust and resin, and the tender place near your thumb has opened slightly where the handle rubbed against it again. You begin putting the workshop in order. A chisel is wiped clean before being returned to its place. The adze is checked. Useful offcuts remain together, while shavings and pieces too small for another purpose can become fuel. You pick up one short piece and turn it in your hand. For a moment you consider keeping it. Then you decide there's nothing useful left in it and place it with the waste. The repaired stool waits nearby. So does the joint you fitted earlier, and against the wall rests the beam that began your day. You walk over to it one final time. Nothing about it has changed. It still looks good. That is what made the decision difficult. A rotten beam would require little judgment. A deep split would announce its weakness. This one asks more from you because it is almost right. You know what you originally intended to make from it. You also know now that you will not. There are other places where the direction of its fibres will matter less, other purposes for which the same timber may serve perfectly well. So it stays. Tomorrow or another day it will become something else. You leave it against the wall. Nobody will know that decision was made. Whatever the timber eventually becomes may be used for years by someone who never knows that its first intended purpose was abandoned before the first cut. Much of what you know survives in this way, not in explanations, in things that continue to work. You learned by watching other hands before your own became certain, then by seeing which joints held, which boards moved, which timbers split, and which repairs returned to the workshop. Over time, the differences became easier to notice. The direction of fibres, the position of a knot, the resistance beneath a blade. the sound carried through a length of timber, the slight movement of a joint that does not yet fit as it should. None of these things makes you famous, they make you useful. Outside, Rome is settling toward evening. A family closes wooden shutters against the street. Somewhere a merchant stacks goods onto shelving. A cart continues home on wooden wheels. A mason steps down from a platform supported by timber. Above them, roof tiles rest upon wooden frames that most of the people sleeping beneath them will never see. Tomorrow much of this will be taken for granted again. That is what ordinary things are allowed to become when they work. You step outside and begin closing the workshop. For one last moment your hand rests against the wooden door. The Rome around you seems permanent. Stone walls, brick buildings, concrete vaults and columns rise above streets crowded with people. Those are the things most likely to endure. The timber beneath roofs will decay. Doors will disappear. Floors will burn or rot. Scaffolds will be dismantled. Furniture will break. Carts will wear apart. Workbenches will be repaired, cut down, reused, and eventually lost. Much of the wooden city will vanish. What remains will tell only part of the story. Today, you stood on timber so another man could work in stone. You shaped wood to fit a building that refused to match its measurements. You repaired something old with a piece too small for another job, and you chose not to cut a beam simply because experience told you that another use would suit it better. The strength in your shoulders mattered. So did the sharpness of your tools, but neither was enough on its own. Long before the blade entered the timber, you had to understand what was beneath your hands, which piece, which direction, how much to remove, and when to stop. The workshop is quiet now. Tomorrow the saw will bite again, the adze will scatter fresh shavings across the floor, and another piece of timber will arrive carrying its own knots, fibres and imperfections. Before any of that happens, you will do what years of work have taught you to do. You will look, you will touch, and sometimes you will listen. Thank you for joining me for another journey into the past. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow the show so you never miss another ordinary life. Until next time, remember, every road, loaf of bread, fishing net, workshop, and home was built by hands history rarely recorded. This has been History of Ordinary People, Live the Lives History Forgot.